The night my son looked me in the eyes and said, "If you're gone, no one will miss you." Something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. It cracked in silence, the way a lifetime of sacrifice does when it is met with contempt instead of gratitude. I had given him everything: my money, my time, my protection, my love. And in return, I became invisible. So I did the one thing he never expected. I walked away. What followed was not revenge, but a reckoning. Because when a mother disappears, the truth has nowhere left to hide. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 68 years old. I have lived in Phoenix, Arizona for most of my life, long enough to watch the desert turn into suburbs and small roads turn into highways. I was never a woman who chased luxury or attention. I built my life slowly, carefully, with patience and discipline, and I was proud of what I created with my own hands. When I was in my 20s, I bought a small gas station on the edge of town. It was not much to look at, but it was mine. I worked 6 days a week, often from sunrise to late evening, learning how to manage inventory, handle customers, and keep the business running even when profits were thin. Over the years, I saved every extra dollar. Eventually, I bought a second property, then a small warehouse, and later a few commercial units that I rented out to local businesses. My husband passed away more than a decade ago. Losing him taught me how to stand on my own. I learned how to manage finances, negotiate contracts, and make decisions without depending on anyone else. By the time I retired, I was financially stable. I was not wealthy in a flashy way, but I had security, comfort, and peace of mind. I owned a large suburban house in Phoenix, the kind with a wide driveway, a shaded backyard, and enough rooms for a growing family. When my son Brian and his wife Melissa began struggling financially, I invited them to move in. They had 2 children, and I believed family should help family. What was supposed to be temporary slowly became permanent. At first, I did not mind. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, and the property taxes. I covered the school tuition for my grandchildren and the insurance for Brian's car. I even gave Melissa a credit card for household expenses and family needs. I told myself that this was what a good mother did. I told myself that my support was an act of love. But over time, the tone in the house changed. Melissa stopped calling me Mom. She used my first name instead, as if I were a neighbor or a distant relative. Brian only spoke to me when something needed to be paid or fixed. Decisions about renovations, vacations, and even household rules were made without my input, despite the fact that I was funding nearly everything. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. Some evenings, I ate dinner alone while the rest of the family sat in the living room scrolling through their phones. Conversations felt brief and transactional. I was no longer asked how my day had been or what I needed. I was only asked what I could provide. Still, I said nothing. I had spent my whole life solving problems quietly. I believed that if I kept things running smoothly, the harmony of the family would remain intact. I confused financial support with emotional connection. I told myself that my role was to protect them from struggle, just as I had protected myself all those years ago. Deep down, however, I felt something slipping away. The warmth I once felt as a mother had been replaced by distance. Respect had faded into expectation. Gratitude had been replaced by routine. My presence was no longer valued only my resources. Yet I stayed silent. I loved my son. I loved my grandchildren. And I believed that love meant endurance. I believed it meant giving without complaint. I believed that sacrifice was simply part of being a mother. What I did not realize was that my silence was teaching them something I never intended. It was teaching them that my feelings did not matter. It was teaching them that my generosity had no limits. It was teaching them that I would always stay, no matter how invisible I became. I did not know then that a single sentence, spoken casually and without thought, would shatter that illusion. I did not know that my understanding of love, family, and self-worth was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. All I knew was that something in my life no longer felt balanced, and the foundation I had built so carefully was beginning to crack. If you are still watching and feeling the weight of that moment, comment 1 below to let me know you are with me, because what happened next changed everything in ways I never imagined. My grandson's 10th birthday was supposed to be a simple celebration. When I imagined it, I thought of a few balloons, a homemade cake, and a small group of friends running around the backyard. Instead, what I walked into that afternoon felt more like a stage production than a family gathering. The yard was filled with oversized decorations, rented furniture, and a themed display that looked like something pulled straight from a social media advertisement. There were professional banners, a dessert table stacked with custom treats, and a hired entertainer wearing a bright costume. Melissa moved through the crowd with her phone held high, recording every detail, adjusting angles, and instructing people where to stand. The party was not just for the children, it was for an audience online. I smiled, greeted the guests, and watched my grandson open his presents. He was happy, and that mattered to me. Still, a quiet unease settled in my chest as I looked around at how much effort and money had gone into a single afternoon. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the yard was scattered with empty cups and torn wrapping paper, I reviewed the expenses. The total came close to $38,000. The number stared back at me from the screen, heavy and undeniable. No one had asked me. No one had mentioned a budget. The money had simply been spent, as if it were endless. I waited until the house was calm before speaking to Brian. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of anything. I only asked why the celebration had needed to be so extravagant. I reminded him that the children would have been just as happy with something simpler. His reaction was immediate and sharp. He told me I worried too much about money. He said I was always looking for problems instead of enjoying life. According to him, the family deserved to live well, and I should stop counting every dollar. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. If you were gone tomorrow, nobody would miss you. The words were not shouted. They were not spoken in anger. They were said casually, as if they were obvious. Melissa laughed softly nearby, scrolling through her phone. No one else in the room reacted. Conversations continued. Plates were cleared. The moment passed for everyone except me. I felt something sink deep inside my chest, heavy and cold. It was not just the words themselves, but what they revealed. In that instant, I understood how my presence was truly viewed. I was not a mother to be respected. I was not a person whose feelings mattered. I was a source of money, nothing more. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not ask for an apology. I simply walked away. Upstairs, in the quiet of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the walls. Every piece of furniture in that house belonged to me. Every bill was paid with my money. Yet I had never felt more like a stranger in my own space. I opened my closet and pulled out a small suitcase. I packed only what I needed: clothes for a few days, my documents, my phone charger. Nothing sentimental, nothing heavy. I was not running away from my life. I was stepping out of a situation that no longer honored me. As I zipped the bag, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The hurt was still there, but it was no longer controlling me. I had spent decades building stability for others. Now, it was time to protect my own. Before leaving, I walked through the hallway one last time. I passed the family photos, the framed memories, the signs of a life I had supported in silence. I realized that staying would only teach them that their words had no consequences. I stepped outside into the warm desert night and closed the door behind me. For the first time in years, I was not thinking about what I owed anyone else. I was thinking about what I owed myself. If you are still here and wondering how far this situation will go, comment 2 below to stay with me. The next chapter reveals the first real consequences of walking away. I checked into a modest hotel in Scottsdale that same night. It was quiet, clean, and far enough from my house to give me the space I needed to think. The room was simple, with beige walls, a small desk, and a window that faced the desert hills. For the first time in years, I was completely alone. The silence felt strange at first. There were no voices in the next room, no television playing in the background, no one asking me for anything. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet settle around me. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt clear. The next morning, I made a few phone calls. First, I called my lawyer, a woman who had handled my finances for over 20 years. I explained that I wanted to separate all shared accounts immediately. She did not ask many questions. She knew me well enough to understand that this was not a decision I made lightly. Then I called my bank. I asked them to freeze the credit card assigned to Melissa. I removed Brian's access to my personal accounts. I canceled the automatic payments for their car insurance, the children's private school tuition, and several household services that had been billed under my name for years. I did not feel cruel while doing it. I felt responsible. For too long, my support had turned into dependence. I was no longer helping my family grow. I was holding them in place, and in doing so, I had allowed myself to disappear. By midday, my phone began to buzz. Brian called first. His tone was sharp, demanding to know why his card was not working. I did not answer. Minutes later, he called again, then again. By the 4th call, the anger in his voice had turned into concern. Melissa followed with messages. She said there must have been a mistake. She said the children needed their tuition paid. She said the electricity company had sent a warning. None of the messages contained an apology. None of them asked how I was feeling. They only asked for access. I set my phone down and walked to the window. The Arizona sun was bright, and the mountains in the distance looked steady and unmoved. For the first time in years, I felt like my own life was not being controlled by someone else's expectations. That evening, I ordered a simple meal and ate it alone at the small desk in my room. I thought about all the dinners I had paid for but rarely enjoyed. I thought about how often I had listened instead of being heard. The following day, the pressure on my family grew. Utility companies sent reminders. The school requested payment confirmation. Insurance notices warned of cancellations. The comfortable life Brian and Melissa had grown used to began to crack under the weight of reality. And still, I stayed silent. It was not punishment. It was distance. I needed them to understand something I had failed to teach for years. My presence was not guaranteed. My support was not automatic. My respect was not optional. With each passing hour, I felt lighter. The guilt I expected never came. Instead, I felt stronger, as if I had finally placed my feet on solid ground after standing in shifting sand for too long. I realized something important during those quiet hours in the hotel. My absence had more power than my money ever did. For decades, I had believed that staying and providing was the best way to love my family. But love without boundaries had turned into permission, permission to ignore me, permission to use me, permission to forget that I was more than a bank account. Now, without me there to absorb the consequences, they were forced to face them. I did not know how far Brian would go to protect the life he had built on my support. I did not know how he would react when he truly understood that I was no longer behind him. But I did know one thing. This was only the beginning. If you are still watching and starting to see the cracks forming, comment 3 below. What unfolds next exposes a truth my son never wanted revealed. From what I later learned, Brian spent the first few days after my departure trying to regain control of his life the only way he knew how. He called old friends, asked for short-term loans, and tried to convince his employer to advance his salary. When that failed, he attempted to pawn his car, only to discover that most of its value was tied to payments he could no longer afford. For years, Brian had believed he was standing on his own 2 feet. He wore expensive suits, talked about his job with confidence, and carried himself like a man who had earned his success. But without my financial support, the foundation beneath him began to crack. I did not step in. I did not offer advice. I watched from a distance and let the situation unfold on its own. What Brian did not know was that his company had already begun an internal audit. The review focused on employee performance, attendance, and financial accountability. I had been aware this process was coming long before Brian ever sensed danger. I said nothing because I believed the truth needed to come from somewhere other than me. For over a decade, I had been a silent investor in the firm that employed my son. I had purchased shares through a family investment trust after his second business failure. My intention at the time had been simple. I wanted to give him stability, a chance to rebuild, and a position where he could grow. Instead, I had built him a shelter. His performance reviews had been quietly adjusted. His missed deadlines were overlooked. His extended lunches and frequent absences were tolerated, not because he was exceptional, but because I had influence. The audit changed everything. This time there were no favors. The numbers were laid out clearly. His productivity was below average. His responsibilities had been neglected. His professional growth had stalled. The position he had held for years no longer made sense for a company focused on efficiency. Brian was dismissed. When I heard the news, I felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction in knowing my son had lost his job. What I felt instead was a quiet understanding of the role I had played in shaping him. I had given him comfort when he needed challenge. I had provided security when he needed discipline. I had protected him from failure, and in doing so, I had protected him from growth. Without his salary, the remaining structure of Brian's life collapsed quickly. Insurance coverage ended. Bills piled up. The sense of identity he had built around his job vanished almost overnight. For the first time, he had no title to introduce himself with, no professional image to maintain, no steady income to hide behind. And still, I remained silent. I did not step forward to explain the truth. I did not tell him how his position had been preserved for years. I wanted him to experience life without the safety net I had woven around him. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I wanted him to understand. There is a difference between support and dependency. I had crossed that line without realizing it. As the pressure on Brian increased, his confidence began to erode. He was no longer the composed man who once dismissed my concerns. He was becoming desperate. His choices grew more reckless. His sense of direction disappeared. From a distance, I could see the pattern forming. When people lose control, they look for shortcuts. When pride is wounded, judgment becomes dangerous. And when someone has never learned how to stand alone, they will reach for anything that promises stability. I knew my son was approaching that edge. The illusion he had lived inside was finally breaking. and what remained was not strength, but uncertainty. The real conflict was no longer about money or respect. It was about survival. And I had a feeling Brian was about to make choices that would change everything. If you are still here and feeling the tension rise, comment 4 below. Because what he did next crossed a line that could never be undone. Brian's financial situation unraveled faster than I expected. Without a salary, the bills that once disappeared quietly each month now demanded attention. Credit cards were declined, loan requests were rejected, collection notices began to arrive. The lifestyle he had built on my support was no longer sustainable. With no clear plan and no safety net, Brian turned to the only place that still held value, my house. He began selling my belongings. At first, it was small things, decorative items, old electronics, furniture pieces that he assumed I would never notice. But as the pressure increased, so did the value of what he took. Jewelry that had belonged to my late husband, collectible antiques I had spent years preserving, items that carried both financial and emotional weight. Brian convinced himself that he was only borrowing from me. He believed he could replace the items once his situation improved. What he failed to understand was that he was no longer acting as a desperate son. He was acting as a thief. Years earlier, after a minor burglary in the neighborhood, I had installed security cameras and tracking devices in the storage areas of my home. I never imagined those systems would one day be used to monitor my own child. Yet every movement, every removal of property was quietly recorded. Brian arranged a meeting with a buyer in a shopping center parking lot on the outskirts of Phoenix. He brought several pieces of jewelry and a few antiques wrapped in cloth. His hands shook as he laid them out in the trunk of his car. He felt rushed. He felt cornered. But he also felt justified. What he did not know was that the tracking system had already alerted local authorities to suspicious activity involving registered property. The items had been reported as removed without my consent. Before the exchange could be completed, police vehicles entered the parking lot. Officers approached Brian's car and began asking questions. The buyer stepped back, quickly distancing himself from the situation. The items were inspected and identified as belonging to me. Brian stood there, exposed and humiliated, as his explanations fell apart. His confidence was gone. His carefully constructed image collapsed in front of strangers. The consequences reached home quickly. Melissa panicked when she learned what had happened. She worried about how the situation would look to neighbors and friends. The perfect family image she had curated online began to crumble. Posts were deleted. Accounts went quiet. Whispers replaced compliments. The house that once felt like a stage for luxury now felt like a place of tension and fear. When I received the report from my lawyer, I felt no satisfaction. I did not feel proud. I did not feel victorious. What I felt was a deep, sobering clarity. My son had crossed a line. He was no longer simply dependent. He was no longer just irresponsible. He had allowed desperation to guide his actions, and desperation had led him to violate trust in the most serious way. I realized then that my absence had revealed more than disrespect. It had exposed how fragile Brian's sense of responsibility truly was. Without structure, without limits, he had chosen the fastest escape instead of the hardest solution. The legal consequences were only beginning. Investigations take time, and records leave trails. I knew that what had happened in that parking lot would not simply disappear. Brian's world was shrinking. And for the first time, I understood that this was no longer a family disagreement. It was a turning point that would reshape our lives. I had hoped my departure would teach him humility. I had hoped it would encourage growth. Instead, it had uncovered something darker. The safety I had provided for decades had not built strength. It had built dependency, and when that dependency was stripped away, it revealed how unprepared my son truly was to face reality. What came next would not be gentle. The path forward was no longer about teaching lessons. It was about facing consequences. And I knew that Brian's choices were about to lead us all into far more dangerous territory. The days following Brian's encounter with the police were heavy with tension. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood. People who once waved from their driveways now avoided eye contact. The house that had always felt busy and loud grew strangely silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Melissa became restless. She paced the rooms, made frantic phone calls, and whispered behind closed doors. The children sensed the change, even if they did not understand it. They asked why their parents looked so tired. They asked why the house felt different. Brian, on the other hand, withdrew. He stopped calling me. The confidence he once carried had been replaced by a kind of stunned disbelief. For the first time in his life, there was no one stepping in to fix the situation. When my lawyer called with updates, I listened carefully. The attempted sale of my property had triggered more than embarrassment. It had created a legal record. Questions were being asked. Documentation was being reviewed. The incident would not simply fade away. I felt no satisfaction in this. I felt grief, not for the money, but for the realization that my son had reached a point where trust no longer guided his choices. Desperation had taken its place. That was when I made the decision I had been avoiding. I instructed my lawyer to begin the formal process of revoking Brian and Melissa's right to live in my home. The paperwork was clear. The house was legally mine. Their residency had always been conditional, based on respect and responsibility. Both had been broken. The eviction notice was delivered quietly, without drama. It outlined the timeline. It explained their obligations. It left no room for negotiation. Brian was shocked. Melissa was furious. From what I was told, Melissa blamed me for everything. She accused me of being heartless. She said I was destroying the family. Brian said very little. His silence spoke louder than any argument. The children were confused. They did not understand why boxes were being packed or why their rooms felt different. They did not know the details, only that something important was ending. I stayed away. Every part of me wanted to step in, to soften the blow, to offer another solution. But I had spent too many years doing exactly that. Each rescue had only delayed the moment when Brian would have to face the consequences of his own choices. This time, I chose distance. Not because I stopped caring, but because I finally understood that caring without boundaries had become harmful. When the eviction date approached, the tension in the house grew heavier. Melissa argued. Brian avoided confrontation. The atmosphere became brittle, like glass under pressure. I felt sadness, but not guilt. Sadness for what had been lost. Sadness for the family we once were. Sadness for the role I had played in allowing things to reach this point. But guilt no longer controlled me. I had accepted a difficult truth. Growth often begins with loss. Responsibility is learned through discomfort. And respect cannot exist without consequences. As the final days passed, I remained in my quiet hotel room, watching the desert sky change colors each evening. The mountains stood steady, unmoved by human conflict. Their stillness reminded me that not everything in life needs to be controlled. Some things must simply be allowed to unfold. I knew Brian was running out of options. His financial situation was unstable. His support system was crumbling. His sense of direction was fading. Desperation has a way of narrowing vision. When people feel trapped, they stop thinking clearly. They reach for quick solutions instead of wise ones, and Brian had never learned how to stand alone. The storm was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. If you are still watching and wondering how much worse this can get, comment 6 below. The truth hidden beneath the surface will shock you. I thought I had already seen the worst of Brian's choices. Losing his job, stealing from my home, and facing public embarrassment felt like the deepest point a person could fall. I was wrong. The real damage had been hidden beneath the surface for months. My lawyer called me one morning with a tone I had never heard from her before. She told me that several financial inquiries had been made using my name. At first, I assumed it was another mistake, perhaps a clerical error tied to my assets. But when she began listing the details, I realized something far more serious was happening. Brian had been borrowing money, not from banks, not from traditional lenders. These were private financial groups that specialized in high-risk loans. The amounts were staggering, far beyond anything my son had ever earned on his own. The debts had been accumulating quietly, hidden behind false paperwork and rushed signatures. Then came the part that made my chest tighten. My name was on the documents, not my real signature, but a careful imitation. Brian had claimed authority he never had. He had used my identity to secure money he could not repay. In doing so, he crossed a boundary that could never be undone. Worse still, some of my property had been listed as collateral. My assets, my home, and my financial reputation had been placed at risk without my knowledge or consent. The lenders were no longer just looking for Brian. They were watching me. The betrayal felt deeper than any insult he had ever spoken. This was not about money anymore. This was about trust. For years, I had protected my son from consequences. I had shielded him from failure. I had believed that love meant providing. Now, I saw the result of that belief in black and white ink on legal documents. Brian had not just failed, he had endangered me. My lawyer explained my options carefully. I could pay off the debt and make the problem disappear quietly. It would protect my reputation and keep everything out of the public eye. Many people in my position would have chosen that path. I did not. Instead, I made a different choice. Rather than paying the lenders, I negotiated with them. I offered to purchase the debt directly. This way, the money would not vanish into another reckless cycle. The obligation would transfer to me, legally and formally. Now, Brian would not owe strangers. He would owe me. The power shifted the moment the documents were signed. The forged signature became evidence. The debt became controlled. And my role in the situation changed completely. I was no longer just a mother reacting to her son's mistakes. I was a woman taking control of the damage done to her life. Emotionally, I felt distant. The shock had settled into something colder and more focused. I stopped seeing Brian as a child who needed rescue. I began seeing him as an adult who needed accountability. That shift was painful but necessary. Every choice has a consequence. Every action leaves a mark. Brian had spent years avoiding responsibility, and now the weight of his decisions was impossible to ignore. I knew he would not accept this quietly. Pride rarely allows for calm surrender. When people feel cornered, they often lash out instead of looking inward. Whatever Brian planned to do next, I knew it would not be gentle. The story was no longer just about family. It was about control, truth, and the price of betrayal. After the debt was transferred into my name, Brian disappeared. At first, I assumed he was avoiding responsibility, hiding from legal notices the way he had avoided accountability his entire adult life. But as the days passed, his absence began to feel different. There were no updates, no responses, and no sign that he was trying to resolve anything. He simply vanished from the places he once occupied. My lawyer confirmed that court communications were going unanswered. Certified letters were returned. Phone calls went to voicemail. Even the few remaining friends he had were unable to locate him. Then the messages started. They came late at night, short and bitter, filled with blame rather than reflection. Brian accused me of ruining his life, of destroying his family, of turning him into a stranger in his own city. His tone was no longer defensive. It was sharp, emotional, and unpredictable. I did not respond. Not because I felt nothing, but because I understood that engaging would only feed his instability. His words were not about resolution. They were about control. For the first time, I felt a quiet unease settle in my chest. Brian was no longer just struggling financially. He was unraveling psychologically. The pressure of exposure, debt, and public shame had stripped away the image he worked so hard to maintain. What remained was a man who felt cornered and desperate. That combination is dangerous. I adjusted my routines without announcing the change. I avoided familiar patterns. I limited public appearances. I asked for additional security at my residence and kept my movements private. These were not acts of fear, but of awareness. It is one thing to lose a relationship. It is another to lose emotional stability. At night, I found myself thinking about the boy Brian used to be, the child who once asked questions about everything, the teenager who laughed too loudly and dreamed too freely. Somewhere along the way, responsibility had been replaced by entitlement, and effort by expectation. I grieved that version of him, but I also accepted the reality of the man he had become. Silence can be powerful, but it can also be dangerous. When people feel unheard, they often look for ways to be noticed. And when pride is wounded, those methods are rarely healthy. Brian's behavior grew more erratic. His messages shifted between anger and despair. One moment he blamed me. The next, he blamed the world. His thoughts no longer followed a clear pattern. There was no plan, only reaction. I remained firm in my decision not to engage. Love does not mean surrendering to chaos. It means holding boundaries, even when they hurt. Every step I took now was careful, deliberate, and grounded in clarity. I was no longer trying to fix Brian's life. I was protecting my own. The calm I had built around myself felt fragile, like glass under pressure. I could sense that something was approaching, something unresolved and heavy. When people feel they have nothing left to lose, they often reach for extremes. I did not know what Brian would do next, but I knew this silence was not peace. It was the quiet before impact. If you are still here and ready to see how this story truly ends, comment 8 below. The final chapter reveals what remains after everything falls apart. Brian contacted me after weeks of silence. His message was short and uneven, as if written by someone who could not hold his thoughts in place. He asked to meet in person. He said he wanted to explain everything. We chose a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, a place where strangers came and went without paying attention to anyone else. When I arrived, Brian was already there. He looked thinner, older, and worn down by something far heavier than the financial stress. The confidence that once defined him was gone. He did not look at me at first. His hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table. Brian spoke in a rush, admitting what I already knew. He confessed to forging my signature, to borrowing money he could not repay, and to using my name as leverage when his life began to collapse. But even in his confession, responsibility remained just out of reach. He blamed pressure. He blamed expectations. He blamed me. He said my standards were too high. He said my absence destroyed his stability. He said everything would have been different if I had stayed. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I had finally accepted something important. Brian was not searching for truth. he was searching for relief. And relief often comes in the form of blame. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not try to correct his version of the story. I had spent too many years explaining myself to someone who only heard what he wanted to hear. When I finally spoke, my words were calm and deliberate. I told him that love does not excuse deception. I told him that support does not mean surrender. And I told him that consequences are not cruelty. Brian's eyes filled with frustration, not understanding. Shortly after our meeting, formal charges were filed. The forged documents became evidence. The financial records became undeniable. What he had tried to escape now stood clearly in front of him. His future was uncertain. There were legal processes ahead, financial penalties, and a long road of accountability. The life he once believed was guaranteed had disappeared completely. I did not attend the hearings. I did not make statements. I allowed the system to handle what I could no longer fix. Walking away from that cafe, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had finally accepted that I could not rescue someone who refused to grow. The relationship I once fought to protect had changed into something unrecognizable. The love remained, but the trust was gone. Some losses do not come with dramatic endings. They come quietly, through understanding. And sometimes, closure is not about forgiveness. It is about letting go. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. Months passed after everything with Brian reached its end. The chaos that once filled my days slowly faded into silence. My mornings became quiet again. My evenings were calm, no frantic phone calls, no sudden crises, no feeling that I was constantly holding someone else's life together. For the first time in years, my life felt like my own. I began focusing on the small, steady routines that brought me peace. Long walks in the early morning. Simple meals prepared without pressure. Books I had once set aside for emergencies that never truly ended. The absence of constant stress allowed my thoughts to breathe. Emotionally, healing did not happen all at once. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. A familiar song, a place we used to visit, a photograph tucked away in a drawer. But instead of pain, I felt acceptance. The relationship I had with my son was not what I had once imagined it would be, and that was something I finally allowed myself to grieve without guilt. I learned an important truth through all of this. Love does not mean sacrificing yourself until there is nothing left. Care does not require control, and helping someone does not mean protecting them from every consequence they create. Real love has boundaries. For years, I believed that providing comfort was the same as offering guidance. I believed that shielding my family from hardship was the same as preparing them for life. I was wrong. By removing struggle, I had also removed growth. Stepping away was not abandonment. It was necessary. In the quiet that followed, I rediscovered who I was outside of being someone's safety net. I was not just a mother. I was a woman with her own identity, her own values, and her own right to peace. I acknowledged my mistakes without letting them define me. I accepted that I had played a role in shaping the situation, but I also accepted that I was allowed to change. The past could not be rewritten, but the future could be lived differently. There is strength in knowing when to step back. There is power in silence, and there is dignity in choosing yourself after years of choosing others. When my son once said that no one would miss me if I was gone, he was wrong. But he was also right about one thing. The version of me that allowed herself to disappear was no longer needed. The woman who remained was stronger, clearer, and finally present in her own life. Sometimes leaving is not a loss. Sometimes it is the beginning of peace. Life has a way of revealing what truly matters when everything familiar falls away. When comfort turns into dependency and love becomes control, growth can no longer exist. Sometimes, the hardest step forward is choosing distance over rescue, silence over argument, and self respect over sacrifice. Letting go is not a sign of weakness, it is an act of courage. True strength is not found in saving others from their mistakes, but in allowing them the space to face those mistakes on their own. Healing begins when boundaries are honored, when responsibility is accepted, and when we finally choose to stand firmly in our own truth. Thank you for spending this time with us and reflecting on this journey. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories that inspire growth, resilience, and self-worth.